Okay, there it is. Okay, so in just kind of looking at the basic makeup of this model in the simulation, you can see some of these structures, right? So if you look, right here, that's that type bundle structure that we were looking at before. There are some other layers in here. I'm not going to get into all the nitty gritty on this. We could be here for hours, but you have a gate layer throughout. You have a detector layer throughout. And what we're looking at here and kind of how I've set this up, and remember this is all arbitrary, just to simulate the dynamics, but this would correlate to the left side of the visual field, this to the center, this to the right. Now if we drill down on this left side, let's look at the left side here. There are two type bundles associated to the left visual field. In this case, we'll call them digits and letters, right? And you can see in the network, I've provided a site for executive top-down input. So type 1 and type 2, and these feed into these networks, these focusing networks. So again, you can see this is a focusing network, this is a focusing network, this is a focusing network. And what these focusing networks are doing is focusing on type. So these are focusers for the object dimension of coalitions. This one up here, this guy going through this spider web, is a focusing network for spatial location. So this is focusing in that spatial dimension of the location dimension of a coalition. Now these focusing networks are fed by these executive nodes here, as I'm calling them executive nodes, and what it allows me to do is provide top-down input into the network to tell it, is type 1 or type 2, so is it digits and letters, which one is a target. So I can tell the network which one's a target, or I can tell it no target at all, give it no input. I can give it top-down information regarding spatial location. Which spatial location are we focusing on? I can choose 2 of the 3, 1 of the 3, none of the 3. All 3 would be the same as none. But anyway, so that's kind of the way that this is set up. You can see the modulatory pairs here. Blue represents inhibitory projections, right? And you can see there's inhibitory projections coming from this suppression unit and inhibitory projections coming from this focusing inhibitor, right? So here's our, and I realize this is kind of inverted from what the diagram was, but here's our focusing exciter. So let's say a detector unit for type 1 detects activity in the gate and passes it along. It will also excite this focusing exciter, which will then inhibit this focusing inhibitor, thus inhibiting gate units for the other type, right? So that's how we focus along the object dimension, and the exact same thing is happening here with the spatial dimension. So a detector, and this is kind of a spatial aggregator here. So if it detects activity in any detector unit, if it receives activation from any detector unit regardless of type within its spatial location, it will pass that along to a spatial focusing exciter, which will then excite the two inhibitors correlating to the other locations, and then those inhibitors will then feed into these, rather than having them inhibit every single gate unit, which I think would have been a computational nightmare. What I just had them do was feed right into the two focusing inhibitors in this object focuser, right? So it's performing the same duty. Again, this is all arbitrary, and it's just a means to simulate the dynamics, right? So let's do a simulation. So I'm going to move these guys down here. Look at how cool this program is. This is so cool. It's like Legos for neuroscience nerds. So I definitely recommend it. And this model here, you can make a model like this in an hour if you want to. It's not a complicated system. So what I'm going to do is create an input table. And you can see here, just to show you exactly how this works. Each line, each row represents a step. So a step in the network goes through steps or iterations. It's an iteration. In the case of this model, the way that I've modeled it and the way that I've interpreted the data, I'm calling each iteration 10 milliseconds, right? So right here we have 50 milliseconds of time. But we're going to open up, in this case, let's open up, and I have all of my protocols lined up. And of course, if anybody wants the code, the access for this model, the files, all of my protocols that I've created for it, let me know. It's all yours. If nothing else, you'll have a ton of fun playing with it. So you can see, and we're going to go through this in a second, I've got 3 different experiments that I'm running through. I've got values for spatial queuing to look at attentional shift. I've got valid queue, no queue, invalid queue. RSVP, a classic. T2 presented at lag 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 9. And this one is awesome, and this is the one I'm going to show you, is dual stream RSVP. And so let's look at, let's do lag 3. Boom. So now you can see it's populated. We have several hundred milliseconds worth of inputs, and so the inputs are binary. So the protocol is essentially, what I'm doing is just equating the computer program for RSVP and just presenting it to this network. The assumption that I'm making, there's a lot of assumptions that I'm making, but one of the assumptions that I'm making here is that in accordance with the 2-stage model of attentional processing, so Mary Potter at MIT, Chun and Potter, 1990, I believe, 1995. They assume that there's 2 stages, right? So in the first stage, all visual information is processed, and I'm assuming that the first stage ends here at my input units. So all information from the visual field is processed, and it reaches this layer, right? And I like to look at this and think, man, that looks like a cell membrane. But so it reaches this, and something is happening in this layer that kind of is a demarcation point into the second stage of attentional processing, where only some things get processed, right? Only some things receive representation, and that's what we call selective attention, right? So this kind of represents that, and so my assumption is that everything presented to the eyes reaches this point, and what I'm concerned with is what happens after that point. So the input data for this simulation looks like this: zeros and ones. So neuron 35, which one's 35? Neuron 35 here, which is a type 2, what I call type 2 object F, right? So type 2 object F occurs 3 times throughout the model. This is type 2 object F presented to the left side of the model. And so for 70 milliseconds, I present this stimulus to this neuron, right? At full strength, right? Ones and zeros here. This is just, it's completely binary. And all the dynamics get teased out here. The second assumption here is that all the stimuli that are presented to the network have 100% equal salience, right? Which obviously isn't the case in the real world. Get into salience dynamics in future studies, future simulations, but for now, that is the second assumption here, is that all of the stimuli presented are of equal salience. Cool. So now, and here's this platform is so awesome. I'm going to start, and you can run these super fast and just pull the data out. And again, here we go, just to show you. To record, all you have to do is group, and this layer of neurons I used as my output data layer, my output layer. And all you have to do is record. Boom, start recording, it generates a CSV file, and then you can aggregate all your data however you want from the CSV. I like the CSV because I can just throw it into R and do all kinds of fun stuff with it. But yeah, super easy. If I wanted to know what was going on with these two, I can just convert the neurons to a neuron group and then start recording, and it's going to generate all the data throughout. For it's going to record the state of that unit at each iteration. So I get to look at a granularity of 10 milliseconds in this unit, or in this model. So that's pretty awesome. It's pretty awesome. And of course, I could simulate this any way that I want. I can make each one of these 1 millisecond if I wanted to. But that's not how I chose to do it. This is much easier. So you can run it through very fast. Boom, it'll do the whole thing in real time. Well, let's look at it step by step so you can see what's going on. So I'm just gonna, each time I hit the space button, it's gonna bring me one step farther. Or at least it's supposed to. There we go. Okay, so nothing is happening in the model. Now, already, here we go. Something is happening, I lied. I've given the model in this protocol here, I've given the model the task direction that type 1 is a target, right? Now, these RSVP streams that I've used, I included distractors. There are distractors all the way through. So anytime that and this is dual stream, so we're looking at a dual stream RSVP protocol. So at any point in time throughout this trial, at every iteration, with the exception of there's a 30 millisecond interstimulus interval between stimuli, but there are 2 stimuli being presented to the network, one on each side, either distractor or target, right? So distractors, being type 2, will land in these columns or in these bundles, right? But you'll see that they won't be detected because I've given it the task direction designating type 1, we'll say digits, as targets. So immediately what's happening here? So this top-down activation is feeding into these focusing networks, right? Which is just, again, this is an assumption that I'm making. It's an arbitrary structure, but it achieves the dynamics that I'm trying to simulate. And the dynamic is a top-down bias. So in accordance with that bias competition model, top-down bias regarding object or featural characteristics, right? So the top-down input says we're looking for digits, and so it feeds into this focusing network, which then delivers a bit of inhibition, suppression to gate units associated to the distractor type. Okay, let's move forward. So now you can see the inhibition here, and these neurons can't go below 0, so you won't see that. I eliminated that because it just turned into a nightmare. But so that 0 is as low as they can go. They don't hyperpolarize. But so you can take the level of inhibition as the activation of this inhibitor neuron. And so you can see it's sending quite a bit of inhibition. Now, the first target, I believe, is going to appear on the left side, and then the second target is going to appear at lag 3 on the right side. So let's keep an eye out for that first target to become active. And it has to go through a series, and then you can see, oh, here we've got a distractor being presented to the network there, a distractor being presented to the network there, but no meaningful activation in those gate units because they're being suppressed, because the network is focused on type. It is focused on type 1. Important, here's a little one before I move forward in the trial here. The network is not focused on a spatial location, right? It has no idea where that first target is going to show up. And there is no activity in these spatial focusing nodes. So you can take that to mean that the spatial dimension of the coalition encompasses the entire visual field, right? Or the areas immediately adjacent to the fixation point, whatever degree angle that is. I don't have on the top of my head in those studies, but it encompasses both streams, right? And bear in mind, nothing is happening in this central stream. This is just where that fixation point would be. Okay, so we're progressing forward. Okay, so that distractor activation has subsided. We're in an interstimulus interval. Oh, we have target related activation or input, visual input, and you can see it's already begun to activate a gate neuron. Boom, it's already starting to activate a detector unit, which has already started to elicit some activity in this modulatory pair. Very cool. Now, one little side note to mention in how this works. You'll notice that the gate unit was very readily, very readily accepted that activation, right? But that is not because of any kind of amplification, none at all. So in this case, top-down focusing is taking the form of exclusively inhibition, right? So it focuses on type 1 by suppressing type 2, right? That's kind of again, it's arbitrary, but I found that to be very important for creating these dynamics and avoiding attractor states. So a heavy dependence on inhibition, which I think is pretty consistent with what we see in neurobiology. So yeah, anyway, moving forward. So this activation is going to grow, and remember, this target's going to be presented for 70 milliseconds. So it's 7 iterations. We're already achieving output. Again, another reason why I've added some of these layers is that you'll notice that these values are fairly low, like 2. Well, it doesn't allow me to see a lot of contrast between units. So this layer exists to amplify what is coming out of the network, so that, and you'll see that these numbers get big. So you can see this activity is happening in the modulatory pairs. Now, here's an interesting point. All of the units, all of these gate units associated to this particular type in this location are a little bit amplified. They're a little bit amplified. This is important. And you can see T1 is still being presented. We're still in that 70 milliseconds period. But this is important for lag 1 sparing, right? So there's this brief moment of excitation throughout that bundle. You'll notice that there is no excitation in the same type bundles of the other spatial locations. And that is because, again, coalition formation in this model is heavily influenced by inhibition, not excitation. Now, if I were to present a target to this model, or to the right side in the target type, you'll notice we're starting to get a little bit of spatial focusing, but not quite yet. So this is where we get into lag 0 sparing. If I were to present another target simultaneously in the other stream, the different stream, there's nothing blocking. There's nothing blocking that other target from being processed, right? It's going to be processed. And that's because if I present 2 targets simultaneously before spatial focusing happens, well, I'm presenting them both to the dominant coalition, which is type 1, digits with no spatial specificity. Pretty cool. I really dig that. So in this case, and I kind of get into this a little bit in my write-up, is that a coalition, these perceptual coalitions in this model are more defined by inhibition, by restriction, than they are by amplification. There is a little bit of amplification dynamics here, and I'll get into why we have to have that, but there's a very specific case which leads me to believe that there is some excitation that is involved in this process. But anyway, moving forward. So we'll go through here. Now, this T1 activation has ceased. It's gone. No more. But the model will continue to process that through its layers, right? So its activation does exist. It does survive the termination of stimulus input, right? So it's a little bit of a working memory handoff here. Now, what we can see here is that we are, these neurons here, these detector neurons, are spitting an awful lot of activity into this spatial focusing network, right? You can see that in the object focusing realm, that it's even higher here because we have identified a target, right? But in terms of spatial focusing, that spatial dimension of the coalition, we're now starting to sharply focus. And again, that focus is determined by what is excluded, not by what is included. So these two areas are now being heavily suppressed. So breaking that down a little bit further, and this might help in understanding exactly what a coalition is in how we can compare. You can identify a coalition based on the probability that an individual input will be processed, right? So and we can see this clearly. If we look on this right-hand side, right, everything over here is getting suppressed, everything. Whereas just 70 milliseconds prior, only type 2 was getting suppressed. Now, only type 2 was getting suppressed because of the task demand, right? Because type 2 is not the target, so is being suppressed. But now we can see that there is some amount of suppression happening here of type 1, which is the target. So type 1 is the target, but it's being suppressed on a location-based. So is this particular object column, even though it is the correct identified target, it is being suppressed because it falls outside of that spatial location, right? So if I were to present another target right now, or another stimulus right now, and in fact we've got two more distractors that are being presented. If I were to present this distractor, the odds that it's going to be detected are nil. It's not going to happen. It's not even going to do anything to the gate units, right? And that's because it is outside of the coalition in both dimensions. It is neither the correct object, and it is not in the correct spatial location. Now, if I were to present another target on this side of the model, it is not in the dominant coalition, but it is only not in the dominant coalition in one dimension. So spatially, it is not in the dominant coalition. On the object side, it is. So while neither of these stimuli, if I were to present either of these stimuli to the network, while neither of them are in the coalition, and likely neither of them would be detected at this point. Right now we're in lag 1, where we see a definite deficit in the ability to identify a cross-stream target. And we'll run through that example really quickly. This one is just a tutorial, but a subsequent example will be quick. Anyway, what would happen here is if I were to present a stimulus of equal salience to the object, or to type 1 in this spatial location, it wouldn't be detected, but it would be more likely to be detected than a distractor on this side. I hope that makes sense, and that there are degrees to which a stimulus falls outside of a dominant coalition. It's not binary. And the idea that it's not binary lends us to that focusing in both dimensions. So now here we are, T1 has been presented, it's clearly being processed. We can say that there is most definitely a very strong coalition present in this model, and that coalition is an assembly of these units, right? Now, there's some analysis that I'm going to show you in just a little bit that will actually show you that the dominant coalition here has focused even farther to this particular target identity. But we'll get into that. That I'll have to use a graph of data to show you. So just finishing up this tutorial. So it's still processing T1, and that spatial focusing is becoming narrower and narrower and narrower. It's becoming more exclusionary. You can see these values rising, and then they'll stabilize. And now we get in, so we've gone through the assembly phase of the life cycle dynamics, the temporal dynamics of the focusing. And we've gone through the competition dynamics. We can see that competition happening. Now we're going into the end phase, and this is equally important to attentional dynamics, is the death of a coalition. And you can see, here it goes. So the takeaway here is that a coalition, and here we're about to present T2, a coalition can only survive if it's receiving inputs, right? So it's transient in nature. It will decay once inputs cease. Now, this particular coalition that we were looking at, it had two inputs, right? So one is that executive, a top-down task relevant information that focused us from the onset of the trial on type 1, right? All across the network, type 1. But it took the bottom-up stimulus input to take the focus from these three type bundles down to just this type bundle, right? So that was our assembly phase, that was our formation phase, and that focusing phase. And that focusing was driven by the competition, right? It competed with the others and shut them down, and that's how that focusing happened. Now, as it decays, right, which is what we're seeing here, the way that this decay is manifesting in this network is that we're not losing any of that object dimension focusing. No, let me back up. The object dimension is still focused on type 1, right? But the spatial dimension, this location aspect of the coalition, that competition is dying off because the focus on just the left side of the visual field is now opening up slowly to encompass the rest of the visual field, right? Now I haven't implemented proximity into this. It's just this model is either you're in my location or you're not, and that's why I've only used 3 locations. And really, in this trial, I'm using just these 2 locations, and I can, in fact, I probably will just eliminate this central portion. And that would be a future direction, is to kind of just like looking at Gestalt principles for object focusing is tying in proximity in spatial focusing, and that's very doable. But anyways, that location aspect of the coalition is now decaying, so that opening up the coalition again to include these other 2 type bundles. So that's kind of how that focusing works. Now, and the decay, and I should say that the decay is implemented in this model by utilizing exponential decay functions in the activation functions of all these units. Super simple. It's a drop-down option when you're creating when you're creating a neuron in here. I didn't derive any equations to make that work, but I did mess with the actual coefficients to control the rate of decay. So anyways, as we progress forward, the location aspect is dying, and here we are at lag 3 now. So this is 300 milliseconds after the presentation of T1, and we're going to present T2 to this location. And you can see it is accepting activation, but it is still receiving small amounts of inhibition and suppression from really the dying off of this super specific location coalition. And so what will happen, and I don't know if you saw the activation for T1 went as high as I think 16 up here. And we're going to see what happens over here. So it is detecting. It's detecting T2. And you can see T2 presentation has already stopped, and we're on to the next distractor. It's detecting T2, and it's giving it enough so that it is now sending, it's trying to form its own coalition on this side of the network, right? But it's not. We're getting up to 6, 7. That's about all we're going to get. So here's what happens. T2 was presented to the wrong side of the network, right? There was a coalition in place on the left side of the network, focusing the attentional field on the left side of the network. Now, lag 3 happened to be at a time where the coalition triggered by T1 was in rapid decay, but it wasn't fully decayed. So what happens here is you get a suboptimal representation in the output of the network. Now we can interpret this as less likely that T2 will be detected, right? Which is exactly what we see in dual stream RSVP experiments. So that's, and the network progresses and it resets, right? It runs through the protocol, progresses, it resets, it's done. So basically I chose this particular trial because it does a really good job of showing both aspects of coalition formation and decay, so both in the object and the location sphere. And from what you saw here, you can extrapolate what would happen in the rest of the trials, and I'll show you the results, but before we do, I just want to show you what a lag 1 dual stream trial looks like. So here's, we can do lag 0 too, but so here's lag 1. I'm going to go to the beginning of the trial. And so there's this kind of a special thing about this. If we watch the network again, T1 is going to be presented to the left side here. So I'm going to progress through quickly. We're going to see T1. Here it comes. Okay, so here's target 1 being processed just like last time. Now T1 has ended. We're now in the interstimulus interval. Focusing, coalition focusing has started, right? The location dimension of the coalition has started to specify, and has started to, that zoom lens is starting to constrict around this side of the visual field. But now you can see we're presenting T2. We're presenting T2 at a point where this coalition is really starting to gain gusto, we'll say. It's really starting to hit peak competition ability in its life cycle. It's at the peak of its life cycle. And what we're going to see here is, while this is going to achieve some activation in the gate unit, and I think at lag 3, in the last trial, we got up to 7 here, right? Okay, so now we're at 1, but this inhibition coming into this side of the network is so extreme that we're just not going to get much. So 4 is about as high as we got, right? So what we're seeing here in this case is that that spatial dimension of the coalition rapidly forms in response to T1, and immediately ramps up its competition to exclude everything else. And T2 presented at lag 1, unlike in a single stream trial where lag 1 is spared, in this case we get lag 1 deficit. Its representation is even less than when presenting T2 at lag 3, which is typically where you're going to see some of the worst performance for T2. So this isn't just poor lag 1 performance, this is lag 1 deficit for sure. Last one here. And again, feel free to use that table of contents to skip forward if you don't want to watch another goofy model simulation. Okay, we just zeroed out the network, initialized everything. We're going to pull in lag 0. We're going to do a lag 0 trial just so I can show you the difference. This is fully consistent with the interpretation of results. First of all, the results are consistent with human results, and the way that this model arrives at those results are fully consistent with the interpretation of Lisa Jeffries and company in regards to attentional focusing. So what we saw with lag 1 is a T2 being presented on the side contralateral to the focus of attention, right? So attention in this model, it's due to the focusing of the location dimension of the coalition. T2 was presented on the opposite side. No chance of being detected or of having significant representation. With lag 3, what we saw was T2 being presented on the wrong side, again, contralateral to the side of the formed coalition, except that in lag 3, it was presented during the death phase of that coalition. So that coalition had weakened, and that's why you see a higher representation for lag 3 than for lag 1. What lag 0 is going to show us, and I think it was Bay and Weibel in 2014 that found lag 0 sparing. Whoever's idea it was to try a lag 0 trial that's just genius, because this is perfect. Without lag 0 sparing, I probably wouldn't have had any of these ideas. So lag 0, we're going to present a target on the left and a target on the right at exactly the same time, and let's see what happens. Now, using the idea of perceptual coalitions and the location dimension, and the fact that I am not telling the network where to look for T1, right? All of those things together, we can make a hypothesis. That hypothesis is that the focus of attention should be wide enough to encompass both streams, right? So what that means is that there's no specificity on the location dimension of the coalition. The only specificity that we have is from the task directive to look for digits, right? So what that means in terms of the coalition is that anything presented to this bundle, or this bundle are within the coalition, right? So they should achieve a good degree of representation. Distractors, again, are not a part of that coalition, that active coalition. So they should not. Let's see if that hypothesis pans out. So let's look for target presentation. Okay, here we go. We have a target on the left and a target on the right, and we're off to the races. What we're going to see is both are being heavily represented. And the reason for that is that they didn't have time. They didn't have time to suppress, to form a coalition on their side, right? So this target, this side of the network couldn't form a coalition because of the activity in this one, and this one couldn't form a coalition because of the activity in this one. And what happens is the attentional field remains wide open, right? There is no focusing. And so you achieve a good deal of representation between both. Now, there are some studies that were highlighted, I think done by Sabina Kastner at Princeton, and she did show that when presented with two identical targets in two different locations, you don't get the amount of inhibition or competition between the two, but what you do see is that there is a little bit of a reduced representation for each, and that's consistent. That's what we see in this model. So far, this model seems to be pretty consistent with just about everything. And you can see now they've died out and they decay back to nothing. So I think that's enough for these simulations for now. Of course, if anybody wants me to run through more, I'd be glad to do so. Do it over Skype, or I can create another video, or I also have a tutorial that I made up for this model that you can go in and mess around with it yourself. Just make sure you save a local original copy of this, and because it's very easy to mess these up. And next thing you know, you're dealing with like a bird's nest, and they're all over the place. And right, so this would terrify me, but I have another copy. So